Welcome to episode 68 of No Rares Required. This week is a double episode so that you can get as much arena open prep as you possibly can manage. And I've decided to take some time off in March, so I'll be doing double episodes until I can finish it all up before I leave. And every week I cover the top performing commons and uncommons for a draft in a color pair or archetype you vote on each week here on YouTube. And this week, Azorius, which I covered yesterday, and Simic or Green-Blue won the vote. So the theme on MTGA Arena is collect evidence, and this is somewhat accurate. I've found more success leaning into almost being mono-green to maximize the flourishing Bloomkin, and then using great fixing of the Nervous Gardener and Topiary Panther to splash for off-color bombs. Now, blue is great for counterspells like Repulsive Mutation and Unauthorized Exit, and you can lean heavier into the collect evidence theme, as we'll cover here shortly, but the overall strategy is similar. Look to extend the amount of late-game threats that you are able to use by playing disguised creatures that can either be 3-drop Grey Ogres with Ward 2, or 5+ drops, and use cards like Tunnel Tipster to get to 5 mana before your opponent, where the disguised creatures really start to shine. Because of the rule of 5, your thing is going to trade unless you have 5 mana, and then the rules change. So your opponent won't be able to block you if you get to 5 mana. Or at least without risk, right? So with that, let's cover the cards individually, and when I think you should look to take them during a draft. So I like to calculate the total wins created, and I do this by taking the average of the game played win rate and the game in hand win rate on 17 lands, and then subtract the average win rate of all users in the archetype and multiply it by the number of games played. And this allows me to kind of see what is working for the most amount of people in the archetype. Top of the list here is Repulsive Mutation, which is the Simic Fireball that's also a counterspell and is an amazing card. Loxodon Eavesdropper, which is the 3/3 that spawns a clue token, and then when you draw your second card, it gets +1/+1 in Vigilance, which you trigger off of the clue token. Bite Down on Crime, which is the 4-cost card that looks like it costs 2. It's very poorly designed, in my opinion, the way that they did that. But it only costs 2 because of collect evidence in the graveyard. But the way that it's read is very confusing. Anyway, it's the Bite spell. Yeah, you can collect evidence for 6 to give... cast it for 2 instead of for 4, and it gives a creature +2/+0 until end of turn, and then deals damage equal to its power to target creature. Evidence Examiner is the Simic Signpost uncommon that collects evidence, and then we've got the Doppelgang, which Doppelgang is an absolute bomb. It's a card that I've seen splashed often. It allows you to create X copies and is very expensive, but is an absolute game winner on 8 mana or on 11 mana. Tunnel Tipster is the mana dork that can ramp. It cannot fix, it just taps for green, but then it gets bigger the more disguised creatures you're playing. Nervous Gardener is a disguised creature that can flip up to find a basic land, and put it into your hand. Killer Among Us is one of the top performing uncommons in green. It spawns 3/1/1s, and then a merfolk, a human, and a goblin. You choose one creature type, and then that creature becomes a ninja 5/5. When it's attacking, you can give it +4/+4 and Death Touch. Kellen, Inquisitive Prodigy, is the Simic bomb. It can destroy tokens when it attacks, or it can destroy your own clue tokens and draw. Projector Inspector is the 3/2 detective that does a loot, draws a card, and discards a card whenever a detective comes into play. Glint Weaver is the 3/3 that spreads out 3 +1/+1 counters and then gains life equal to the highest toughness among creatures you control for 7, and it has reach. Flourishing Bloomkin is the disguised creature that when you flip it up for 5, I think it might be 6, you get to look for a forest and put one into play and put one into your hand. So it ramps you, and its power is better the more forests that you have. Danifar is the Simic bomb that cloaks creatures and gives all of your face down cards +1/+1. You've got Cryptic Coat, which is the 3/2 unblockable cloaked card that can be a recurring threat. Vengeful Creeper, which is the 5/5 that can destroy an artifact or an enchantment. And then Hard-Hitting Question, which is a fight spell. As far as total wins destroyed goes, we can do the same process, but look at what's negatively affecting the archetype. And we see a lot of what we've seen before, which is even despite green's amazing fixing, there's still a lot of people who are splashing for cards that aren't really worth it. So like Soul Innervation, if you're going into a Sultai space, has been not a great one to include. Trostani, Three Whispers, is the Celestia bomb. Crashing Footfalls is the Suspend, create 2 4/4s. I was actually kind of surprised to see this one on the list, because as long as the game's going on long enough, you should be able to get that to be good, I would imagine. Slime Against Humanity is the one that like has ooze synergies and is not really a good limited card. Lumbering Laundry is the 4/5 colorless for 5. Bubble Smugglers, the 2/1 that can disguise into a 6/5 for 6 mana. Chalk Outline, which is the enchantment that can spawn 2/2s if you're removing cards from your graveyard. 10th District Hero, which is the 2/3 just bomb and white. Alquist Prof, Master Sleuth, which is the Azorius rare that can investigate for a large amount for on clue tokens and as a 3/3 vigilance. Torch the Witness, which is really good removal in red. Mistway Spy, which is whenever a creature deals damage, you can investigate, and it's a disguised creature or a 1/1 flyer. Lasav, Wearer of Faces, which is the Dimir, can copy something in the graveyard. Proskin Tusker, which is, I think, an Onslaught card, right? An old card that can cycle for 2 and a green to go find a land. And 10 Street Gossip is the Gruul signpost, uncommon, that can tap for face-down creatures, but it's a red-green. Growl Whipcracker is the 3/2 reach Golgari signpost that destroys a token. And then Magnetic Snuffler, which is the colorless that looks for equipment in your graveyard. So basically, don't try to splash too much. There are exceptions to this. Obviously, there are some really good bombs in the set that are worth splashing, but if you see the bomb that you're thinking about on this list, maybe think twice. And then after that, I like to look at the, I take the wins created that I just calculated, and I divide them by the number of times that the card was picked, not specifically played, but so this also includes things that are like picked but put into the sideboard. And then I graph it against the average time that the card was picked, and what this allows me to do is fit the data with the logarithmic regression and compare what the best cards are at different time points within the draft, which, once again, I'm always going to credit you, man. Carl, aka 2Duck Cubed, labeled this value over replacement, and I'm going to give him a shout out every single time that I can. So with this in mind, the top reason to be in Simic is opening up a Vannifar Evolved Enigma. So Vannifar is a 3/4 for 2, a green and a white. At the beginning of combat on your turn, you cloak a card from your hand, or put a +1/+1 counter on each colorless creature you control. So spawning 2/2s, and then making those face-down cards that you have, because colorless creatures include your cloaked creatures, your disguised creatures, as well as like artifact creatures that you have. So like you develop your board, and then it becomes a board pump. Vannifar is absolutely disgusting. And I mentioned this briefly in the Azorius guide yesterday. This is one of the reasons why to pick up the blue-green land anytime that you're in blue, is because for whatever reason, maybe because Simic has always been just a really bad archetype, Vannifar tends to be available more often than it should. And so keep that in mind, that Simic is not a bad archetype in Murders at Karlov Manor. And I look to use Izzet and Simic right now as like the most open, not overdrafted strategies, at least this week. As far second place goes to Kellen, Inquisitive Prodigy, which allows you to investigate, and you may play an additional land for a green and a blue. But you can also play it just as a 3/4 flying vigilance for 2, a green and a blue. And then whenever it attacks, you destroy up to 1 target artifact. And if you controlled that permanent, draw a card. So you can pop your clue tokens for free, or you can remove your opponent's clue tokens. And so I've been very impressed with this card. It's a debate right now of whether or not it deserves the like A game-winning rare quality or grade, and I think it does. I'm very happy to open up Pack 1 Pick 1 Kellen and be like, all right, it's time for some Simic. Hide in Plain Sight has been a very impressive card. You look at the top 5 cards of your library, and you get to cloak 2 of them and put the rest of the bottom of your library in a random order. So you're ideally going to try to hit creature cards with the cloak, because the only time you can uncloak is if they're creature cards. But so being able to get 2 2/2s with ward 2 for 4 is just good enough. And then additionally having the cloak synergies can be a reason. So like Bubble Smuggler does not work particularly well. It does work well with cloak though. So if you had an obscene amount of these rares that were giving you cloak, then Bubble Smuggler actually becomes good. But yeah, you're basically just looking for like additional disguise threats, and this works really well with Vanifar because then you get 2 cloaked cards that become 3/3s and then 4/4s, etc. Similarly, Cryptic Coat gives you a cloaked card. So this one you get a 3/2 Ward 2 creature, and then you can return it for 1 and a blue. It leaves the cloaked creature behind, and then you can play it again. So if they do find a removal for the cloaked creature, then you can replay the Cryptic Coat, and this has been a very impressive one. Unlike Vanifar, though, you don't get to choose something from your hand to cloak. You're cloaking the top card of your library, so it's a little bit more hit and miss on what is actually getting cloaked. The Sharp-Eyed Rookie is particularly good in green. You get a 2/2 Vigilance for 1 and a green, and then whenever a creature enters the battlefield under your control, if its power or toughness is greater than Sharp-Eyed Rookie's, then you get a +1/+1 counter on it. So don't forget that this triggers on both power and toughness, so there's some really cool lines that you can do with this card. And make it into a very large vigilance threat. And even if you can just make it into a 3/3 vigilance on turn 3, then you're being able to attack while they're playing their 2/2 Ward 2 Grey Ogres, and it's been very impressive. And then we've got Steamcore Scholar, which is the Windrake flying vigilance for 2 and a blue that enters the battlefield. You draw 2 cards, and then you discard 2 cards unless you discard an instant or sorcery or creature card with flying. And then we've got Axebane Feryx, which is the 4/4 Death Touch Haste for 2 double pip green and has Ward Collect Evidence 4. So this is very difficult for your opponent to deal with early because a lot of the creatures are understatted and going more wide than they are tall. And so they will have to multiple block this, where it gets at least like a 2-for-1 or a 3-for-1, and the Ward just makes it really difficult for your opponent to use removal on this card early. Axebane Feryx has been amazing. And it's definitely worth noting that Izoni, Center of the Web, is splashable, especially at 6 mana. You can take a long time to find that additional black mana, and then Izoni has been particularly impressive if you have the ability to fill your graveyard with evidence, which this archetype does well, off of the loot from the Projector Inspector, land cycling the Panthers, etc. And so now for the value over replacement for picks 2.5 through 5, and similarly to Azorius, there is a lot in this segment, so I'll try to go as quickly as possible. And so we're starting things off here with Doppelgang. This one is an absolutely amazing card. I do think it is splashable because you're going to be playing it at 8 mana, but in Simic you don't have to splash for it, so that's great. And for 8 mana, you get to copy 2 permanents and create 2 tokens that are copies of each of those permanents. So a total of 4 permanents for 8, and then 9 permanents for 11. So the more that you can get to, like, this is like one of those win conditions that you just need to get to your 8 mana, and then you usually win the game. A Killer Among Us spawns a goblin, a human, and a merfolk, and then you choose either one of those 3. And if the target attacking creature token is the chosen type, you put 3 +1/+1 counters on it. My mistake, I thought it was 4, and it gains Death Touch until end of turn. So as long as you are being the attacker, then this is a 4/4 Death Touch and a 1/1 and a 1/1 for 5. And the hidden part of it really messes with your opponent's mind. As far as on defense, though, this is 3 1/1s for 5. So there are a couple of cards in the set that make the play versus draw worse, and this is one of them. You want to be on the play when you have a Killer Among Us. The Flourishing Bloomkin is the 0/0 that gets +1/+1 for each forest you control, and this is why I was saying you really want to be majority green to take advantage of the Flourishing Bloomkin. If you are more leaning towards blue and splashing green as your secondary color, then Flourishing Bloomkin's power goes down. But it can disguise for 4 and a green, and when it's turned face up, you search your library for 2 forest cards, put one of them onto the battlefield, and then the other into your hand, which ensures that this Flourishing Bloomkin is going to be a big threat. We've got Archdruid's Charm, which the only downside with this card is the triple pip green, and if you're majority green, this is another payoff. You've got 3 options. You can search your library for a creature or land card and reveal it and put it onto the battlefield tapped if it's a land card, otherwise put it into your hand. So you get a tutor for 3, which is really great for finding like a Zoni or something like that later in the game, that just like a card that can help you win the game, like Doppelgang as well. Oh, sorry, not Doppelgang because it's creature or land. But yeah, find your busted bombs. And then put a +1/+1 counter on target creature you control. It deals damage equal to its power to target creature you don't control at instant speed. So they finally made this one. We've seen some sets where this wasn't a rare, and so we've seen this now at rare, which I like. So instant speed, being able to do this bite spell is particularly powerful. And then you have the third option, which I haven't used very much, which is the exile target artifact or enchantment. But there are a couple in the set that you would be happy to have. that option. Hard-hitting question is the fight spell. Target creature you control deals damage equal to its power to target creature or planeswalker you don't control. Sorry, it's a bite spell, but for only 1 green. It's very cheap, and it's good removal in Simic, which Simic tends to struggle with having removal options, and it's somewhat the case, but removal in the set is generally kind of bad because of the Ward 2 on all of the Grey Ogres. So Simic, the downfall of Simic's bad removal is not as important as it is in other sets. That's partly why I think Simic is performing better than it usually does. Greenbelt Radical is a 4/4 for 3 and a green, and then if you pay the disguise cost of 5 double pip green, then when it's turned face up, put a +1/+1 counter on each creature you control. Creatures you control gain trample until end of turn. Notably, this works particularly well with Cloak, because you can turn it face up for 3 and a green. So the more Cloak synergies you have, the more that this becomes an even bigger bomb. But even if you don't have the Cloak synergies, turning it up for 7 is an overrun effect on top of a big body, and usually wins you the game. Tunnel Tipster, you got your 1/1 mana dork that taps for 1 green for 1 and a green, and then at the beginning of your end step, if you played a disguise creature or a cloak creature face down, then it gets a permanent +1/+1 counter, so Tunnel Tipster can then grow into a relevant threat later in the game. Surveillance Monitor works pretty well in this archetype because, like I mentioned, you don't have the detective synergies like you do in Azorius, but you do have more collect evidence synergies, and so it's easier to get the 1/1 colorless Thopter artifact creature token with flying. And then notably, it's whenever you collect evidence, so the more that you're collecting evidence, the more Thopters that you're creating, and this compare particularly nicely with the Signpost Uncommon. And then we've got Analyze the Pollen, which is another one that, like, I'm a little sad to see at Rare, because I really like these effects. I generally cut 1 land for every Analyze the Pollen that I have, and it allows you to do, like, land fixing. And then you can collect evidence for 8 and search your library for a creature or land card, so it gives you also a tutor ability if you have a bomb like a Zoni that you need to go find. Exit Specialist, again, just like being able to bounce your opponent's creatures that they've put 8 mana into, and you pay 2 to do it. It feels worse if you're paying 2 to bounce a ward creature, because then you have to pay 4 for the creature that costs 3. But as long as you're flipping this up later in the game, you can definitely get a really good amount of value out of Exit Specialist. Coerce to Kill, similar to Azorius, I think Coerce to Kill is worth splashing anytime that you are in blue. And anytime that, to an extent, every time that you're in black, depending on how aggressive you are. But this is a built-in 2-for-1. As I mentioned in Azorius, you enchant a creature that your opponent controls, removing it as a threat, because you gain control of it, and then it becomes a 1/1 Death Touch creature that they have to use removal on or trade with. And we've got Props Eidetic Memory. Not as good as it is in Azorius, because you're not going to have as many like Projector, Inspector, Clue tokens drawing all of the time synergies, but you can still have it anytime that you're in blue, so it's worth mentioning. It's when it enters the battlefield, you draw a card, you have no maximum hand size, and then at the beginning of your combat, you give X +1/+1 to token counters onto target creature, where X is the number of cards that you've drawn this turn -1. So the more that you're doing the card draw thing, the more that you're leaning into blue, then the more Props Eidetic Memory goes up. I tend to be more focused on green in my Simic strategy, but it's still a good card and worth, grabbing if you see it. Ill-Timed Explosion is worth splashing. You get to draw 2 cards, and then you may discard 2 cards, and when you do, Ill-Timed Explosion deals X damage to each creature, where X is the greatest mana value among cards discarded this way. And what's particularly nice about this in Simic is that you can have a very large, big, beefy green creature that survives your one-sided Wrath. And as long as you can have one thing on the battlefield after your Wrath, you're definitely going to be up. Because we've seen Wraths that, like even a Wrath that destroys everything and then leaves you with a 1/1 token puts you significantly ahead. So Ill-Timed Explosion is particularly nice in this archetype, and look to splash it. Buried in the Garden is another one that I look to splash. You get the, when it enters the battlefield, exile, so it's removal, and then whenever the enchanted land is tapped for mana, its controller adds an additional 1 mana of any color, so it helps you further do the 5-color green nonsense. And then Hedge Maze is worth mentioning again. There's a specific Banth kind of detectives deck where the strategies of Azorius kind of blend into Simic, and so there is a 3-color, you can kind of blend the two, and Hedge Maze helps you do that. And then the Surveil is particularly nice for the collect evidence. And why did I mention Azorius there? Because Hedge Mage was in Azorius, and I didn't do a very good job of explaining it in Azorius. If you look through Simic, there are detectives in the green space that you can look to synergize into as well. This is not to splash white, my apologies, but it does help you with the collect evidence with the Surveil. And then Lost in the Maze is good, just like it is in Azorius. You get kind of like this out cold effect where you can out tempo your opponent, and then tapped creatures you control have hexproof, and you can use that flash. So you can just give all of your tapped creatures hexproof for 2 blue, which can be useful as well, even if you aren't using the tap X ability. The downside with this is you do have to pay the ward. So, and then we've got Case of the Locked Hothouse, and this one is worth mentioning. It allows you to play an additional land on each of your turns, which isn't super important compared to finding the lands from your deck, because like once you get all the land out of your hand, then that's like inevitably, that's going to happen at some point in the game anyway. But then once you control 7 or more lands, that allows you to look at the top card of your library, and you may play lands, creatures, and enchantment spells from the top of your library. So it gives you excellent dig. And then unlike Azorius, Simic is doing fine as far as pick 5 and onward. It is still very underdrafted, just like Izzet. And this is at the top of the list here. We've got the Repulsive Mutation. The fact that you can pick this up in pick 5 says a lot, because this card is amazing. And the longer that the set goes on, the more likely that I imagine that we're gonna see Repulsive Mutation being picked up in other archetypes, because it is splashable. You get an X green and a blue to put X +1/+1 counters on target creature you control, and then counter up to 1 target spell unless its controller pays mana equal to the greatest power among creatures you control. So you can use this to win a combat fight while simultaneously destroying something that your opponent was playing like a combat trick. So Repulsive Mutation just works really well. I've been very impressed with it. Same thing with the Evidence Examiner, the Simic Signpost. You get a 2/2 for a green and a blue. At the beginning of combat on your turn, you may collect evidence 4, and then whenever you collect evidence, investigate. So you're turning your graveyard into card draw, and you know, it depends on how good you are at creating enough evidence for this. But I feel like even if you don't do the collect evidence 4 off of this, if you're doing the collect evidence off of some of your other cards, the fact that they start to synergize every time that you collect evidence, you're also creating a clue token, just really helps outvalue your opponent. And then Glintweaver, you get 3/3 reach. When it enters the battlefield, distribute 3 +1/+1 counters among 1, 2, or 3 target creatures. Then you gain life equal to the greatest toughness among creatures you control. So this gives you some stabilization against the early pressure. And then you can just play this out as a 6/6 reach that gains you 6 life for 7. So as long as you can survive to the 7 mana, Glintweaver I've been very impressed with. Bite Down on Crime, as I mentioned, you can cast this for 4, and then target creature you control gets +2/+0 until end of turn. It deals damage equal to its power to target creature you don't control. And then as an additional cost to cast the spell, you may collect evidence 6, and then the spell costs 2 less to cast if evidence was collected. And this looks correct, right? Like this is the way that it should be. On Arena, for whatever reason, it was showing up as 1 and a green as its casting cost, and maybe that was a bug. But this makes more sense. You've got a 4-cost spell that then can cost 2 less if you collect the evidence. And but this is a good one. The downside with the sorcery speed, but it's still really good removal in Simic. Loxodon Eavesdropper I've been really impressed with. You get a 3/3 for 4, so you get a Hill Giant that creates a clue token, and then whenever you draw your second card each turn, Loxodon Eavesdropper gets +1/+1 and gains Vigilance until end of turn. And you can pair this with clue tokens, but you can also pair this with like the Projector Inspector, and it is a detective, which is why I was kind of mentioning the detective space in Azorius. So there's other ways to trigger this than just clue tokens, and then getting a 4/4 vigilance creature that draws you a card is a pretty decent card. Get a Leg Up has been very impressive. You get an uncommon instant speed until end of turn. Target creature gets +1/+1 for each creature you control and gains reach. So I've been able to snag things like, you know, Ezram and things like that out of the sky with Get a Leg Up. And you know, you can also just hit for a ton of damage, because most of them, even this archetype that's not going particularly wide, because it's not a blocking format, the board states tend to get wide, and you're attacking and then your opponent's attacking, and it's just getting bigger and bigger. So Get a Leg Up can be a ton of damage. Projector Inspector, as I mentioned, has synergies with like the Loxodon. You have some other detectives within the Simic space that help you trigger the loot, and then the loot also helps you get the collect evidence, which you have further synergies for in this archetype. Nervous Gardener is really good for the fixing. You can either just play it out as a 2/2 Grizzly Bear, or you can undisguise it for 1 green. So for a total of 4, you get a 2/2 that searches your library for a land card, and you put it into your hand. So this can be good for those off-color bombs. And I've liked Topiary Panther, even if I'm not splashing for off-color bombs. Even if I'm just going to be like looking for just something to collect evidence into the graveyard, so that later I can then use the collect evidence 6 while also fixing my early land draws. And then later in the game, if you top deck it, you get a 6/5 Trampler, which is perfectly fine. And then Cold Case Cracker, you don't need the detective synergies to make the Phantom Monster, the 3/3 flyer for 3 and a blue, that creates a clue token when it dies, worthwhile. And similarly, the Escape Tunnel works really well for, even if you're not fixing, being able to create some unblockable damage and then flip it up. Like your Flourishing Bloomkin, for example, can flip up to hit for an obscene amount of damage unblockable with Escape Tunnel. So, and then as far as pick 8 and onward, there are a lot of cards that I'm looking to wheel in Simic. And this is why I was saying, like, the secret is not out yet as far as Simic is concerned. So top of the list here, we've got Vengeful Creeper, which is the disguise creature that can undisguise for 5 and a green. And when it is turned face up, destroy target artifact or enchantment. And then you've got Unauthorized Exit, which is the bounce, so similar to Azorius. You have to be kind of selective about avoiding the bad enter the battlefield effects. But finding the right target for this, you can get a lot of value off of it. And then the Surveil can help you smooth your land draws or find better top deck threats later in the game. The Vitu-Ghazi Inspector I've been impressed with in Simic, just because you do have enough synergies to kind of make the collect evidence thing work. And then you don't have to put the +1/+1 counter on it. You can put a +1/+1 counter on something else, and then gaining 2 life. This does help you stabilize. And the 2-drop slot is a little bit weak in blue and in green, so it was another reason to run the Inspector. Whereas in white, you have a little bit better options. Fanatical Strength I've enjoyed. Some of your big green beef doesn't have trample, and so being able to give it +3/+3 and trample works particularly well. And then because you're playing these gray ogres with ward 2 on 3, a lot of your disguise creatures make really good combat trick targets, because it's harder for your opponent to 2-for-1 you with the ward. So if they're blocking your ward creature with their ward creature and you've got Fanatical Strength, you can get the damage through while also removing their threat, which is partly why it's punishing to be blocking in this format. There's a lot of cards like that, like the white has Auspicious Arrival, and then red has the +3/+0 and First Strike and make a clue token. So keep that in mind if you're new to this set. Try not to block. I know sometimes you have to, but Hotshot Investigators I've been impressed with in the Simic archetype, because when it enters the battlefield, return up to 1 target creature return target creature to its owner's hand, and if you controlled it, investigate. So you're not usually going to be popping your own thing back into your hand. You can if you have a very oppressive enter the battlefield effect, but usually you're just going to be trying to do that kind of out, similar to the Unauthorized Exit, hit something of theirs that they've spent a lot of energy and time into, and that they have to replay and redisguise, can just really set your opponent back. So I've been impressed with Bounce. And then Sudden Setback I think has been worth playing. The 2 and a double pit blue, this one can be hit and miss, right? But being able to hit a spell before it even comes down and put it back on top of your opponent's library can just end up time walking your opponent's play. So you're gonna have to be a little bit creative about when you do this, but I've enjoyed at least like maybe 1 copy of the Sudden Setback, and it is available on the wheel, so that is unusual for an uncommon. And then we've got Sanitation Automaton. Once again, like I mentioned earlier, the 2-drops are kind of weak in this format, or in this set. In this archetype. So a 2/1 colorless works well with Vanifar too, because you don't have to have a face-down creature to get the +1/+1. So there are some synergies there. And then anytime that I'm like in the Sultai space, so like Dimir and Simic, and a little bit in Golgari, the Surveil helps me find my land draws while also creating evidence for collecting later. So Sanitation Automaton has been worthwhile. Reasonable Doubt, I don't mind playing counter spells. I do think that they help you versus when you're on the draw versus on the play. If you're playing best of 3, it's one of those cards that like I would bring in when I'm on the draw and I would take out when I'm on the play. In best of 1, it's anybody's guess if you're going to end up on the play or on the draw. And but I've had enough times where a reasonable doubt like swings the game in my favor. Sometimes it misses, and later on in the game, the quenches are better early on. But if you're paying 2 mana to block your first opponent's like ward creature and giving one of your early creatures suspect, I think it works particularly well. And then last but not least, here we've got the Rift Burst Hellion, and I've enjoyed this card in green. You do have to have double pip green, but since I'm being majority green anyway, I've found this one to be a very nice threat. This is the sort of thing, though, that is incredibly punishing to get bounced. So because I cannot replay it for red, I have to disguise it and then flip it up. And so if my opponent bounces this, I've just lost, like, I'm paying 9 mana over 2 turns for a 6/7 reach, right? So the more that your opponent is kind of playing this, you can see why the bounce would be advantageous. And then remember that if you're playing against blue, that this becomes a little bit worse if that is like a best of 3 scenario for you. Anyway, I hope that's helpful. And next week I'll be covering 2 archetypes that you vote here on YouTube. And so remember to cast your vote. And if you have an archetype, remember to cast your vote if you have an archetype that you'd like to see next. And if you played in the Arena Open this weekend, let me know in Discord. I do love hearing how your guys' runs went, and or just let me know how your drafts have been going. I love hearing from you guys. And you can also just leave it in the comments below. I do try to read every comment. And then every Friday, I publish a best of 3 sideboard guide. Every Saturday, a 50-match summary in best of 1. And every Sunday, a standard meta review. And then every Tuesday, I do at least 1 draft guide. And for the next little bit, we're going to be doing 2 a week. So if if you want all of the draft tips, remember to come back next week. And remember to click like and subscribe for near daily Magic the Gathering content. And thanks for listening and being part of my community. Good luck with your games and future trophies. Go crush the Arena Open. And thank you all again for the support.